Thank you. So I'm going to jump right in here and present to you the wonderful cities of the future. This is Nairobi, Kenya. This is Mumbai in India. This is Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And this is Istanbul, Turkey. These, I submit to you, are the beginnings of the cities of the future. Now, why do I say that? I say that because of people like Julius here. I met Julius, this is the day I met Julius, and he was completely freaked out and out of place being in Nairobi because it was his first day there. These neighborhoods and these cities are growing because of rural to urban migration. And in fact, this little girl who was born in the squatter community called Kibera is leading Julius around. He's not leading her around. So, close to 200,000 people a day are making the journey from the rural areas to the city. And if you do the math, that's almost 1.4 million people a week and 70 million people a year. And to bring it down home in less than the time that I've been talking already, that's 130 people every minute. Today, there are 1 billion squatters, 1 in 6 people on the planet, almost. In about 20 years, 25 years, there will be 2 billion squatters, 1 in 4 people on the planet. And if current trends continue, by halfway through this century, there will be 3 billion squatters, and that's better than 1 in 3 people on this planet. Now, just to keep pace with this influx, not to deal with the billion that we already have, but to deal with the 2 billion who are coming, we need to build 35 million homes every year. And that is 96,150 homes a day, and 4,000 dwellings every hour, and 66 houses a minute. So we better get busy. And the UN, in their wonderful way, has determined, well, we don't know whether we can build that many units, but we ought to build homes for 670 million people over the next 15 years. And they estimate that that would cost $294 billion. And that sounds like a huge number, but if you do the math, that's $3 a year for the next 15 years from every person on the planet. And even my squatter friends might be able to afford $3 a year. But the problem is that governments and NGOs are not very efficient at building housing, because if they were, it would have been built already and people wouldn't be living in these slums. They come to the city and they come looking for work, they find work, but they can't find a place to live. And that's why they create these communities. And I'll just give you one statistic about the inability of governments to do this. In Caracas, Venezuela, over the last 80 years, the government, municipal and national, built 650,000 apartments. In the last 80 years, the squatters who came and moved into the barrios there built 2.8 million apartments. So the squatters are much more efficient at doing this than the governments. So here's a virtual tour of the cities of the future. And the thing to remember is, what do you really see in these photos? You can look at this photo and say, degradation, it's horrible, he's living in paper and sticks. But I look at it and I see home improvement in Mumbai. This guy is putting plastic tarps on his roof so he can survive the monsoon. And you can look at this and see weird degradation and strange building forms, but it's kind of neat, this self-building. This is a Beko in Rocinha in Rio de Janeiro. And, you know, cantilevered construction, concrete and brick, it's interesting. You can look at this and see this horrible, sodden community in Nairobi. This is Toy Market on the edge of Kibera in Nairobi. And It is true that in the rains and the mud in this market are so, the mud is so thick from the rain that it sucked the heels right off my shoes. But it's a thriving market with thousands of squatter merchants. And you can look at this and say, my God, Martha, they're stealing electricity. And they are. This is from Rocinha in Brazil. And now they're stealing. But Proudhon said property is robbery. And then that was updated in a way that I particularly like, that André Gorz said that under capitalism, robbery is poetry. So this is a rather poetic image, in fact. And you could look at this and say raw sewage floating in between and in the middle of people's homes. But I look at it and I see this little business here. It says hotel. Now in Nairobi and in Mumbai, hotels are restaurants. And this is in fact a butcher shop and a restaurant right in the squatter community. Squatters actually eat out quite a bit. Although it's surprising to know it. And you can look at this picture and say, again, how horrible, you know? People risk death every day in these communities. This is also Nairobi, and this is the freight line coming right through the squatter community. And I look at it and say, people are so desperately interested in buying and selling that they're willing to risk death. There's a tremendous amount of economic activity in these communities. These are a very big business in Kenya is called mitumba, which is used clothing. And many of the donations that people make to Goodwill and other outfits are actually wind up being sold in Africa for very cheap to people in the squatter communities. And here's a main street, Fifth Avenue in Kibera. And you can look at it and again say tin roofs and mud and people carrying things in wheelbarrows. This is horrible degradation. And I'm not going to disagree, but I am going to point out that you've got a health clinic, you've got a soda distributor, you've got several beauty salons, you've got 2 or 3 bars, and you've got a church, all in this little strip. And this is just one tiny portion of a community that houses anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million people. And you can look at this and again say, what kind of horrible construction is this? I look at it and I see water pipes, these plastic water pipes. I see electricity. And the combination of them is this little hut right here. There's a pump in there. And that's how people get their water in Rocinha. Once they started stealing electricity, they install electric pumps, they start stealing water, and they pump the water up the hill to a tank on their roof. And this pipe runs up to a tank on the roof of this house here. And people have water. So, how do people in these communities transform their communities? Well, they start out pretty much like this. Pretty much the most disgusting place you can possibly think of living. And then over time, they get a little better. This is Rocinha on the hillside in Rio de Janeiro. And scavenged materials you can see, and like a piece of a sign that's being used as roofing. And then you give them a little time, and they create this. This is my friend Süleyman Akaya in Sultanbeyli on the outskirts of Istanbul. And this is the house that he built with his father. And you can see that the roof is now cemented and that it's new tile, and the walls are in better condition. And then people tear down those little one-story dwellings and they start building buildings, multi-story, reinforced concrete and brick. And you can see that people occupy them incrementally. So the top floor here is still vacant, but the other floors have been occupied. And you go further, this is, again, Rocinha, and you see the cityscape that develops in these communities. Many of these buildings that become many stories are built almost like self-built condominiums. Someone builds the ground floor and then sells the roof rights to a friend who builds on top, who sells the roof rights to another friend, and they build on top of that. And the community rises in this wonderful, cacophonous, very free-spirited way. And finally, you even get squatter homes like this, which is the suburban ideal, hey? This is in Sultanbeyli, in Istanbul. Nice garden and a pretty beautiful looking home. So the big question is, how do you get from one to the other? And how do you go from this to this, and maybe even to this? That's Kenya, Istanbul, and, Kenya, Brazil, and Istanbul. My argument is that, number one, you need a guarantee that you won't be evicted. And in a statement that might create some controversy, and I hope I get some tough questions on it afterwards, that does not necessarily mean that you need a title deed. I don't think that in many of these cases, title deeds are the most effective way to give people security of tenure. Because, number one, you have to buy title deeds from the municipality. And I know a number of squatters from my time living in these communities who purchased the title deed by going into hock and getting loans from relatives and from the municipality. And now the relatives in the municipality are demanding to be paid back with money that these squatters don't have. So they may, in fact, be forced to sell the property that they bought and become squatters somewhere further out of town. Also, title deeds change the communal structure of these neighborhoods. They make them, every squatter, a rugged individualist in some way, which completely destroys the sort of creative informality of these communities. I think there's an in-between mechanism that recognizes possession rather than property. How to describe that in legal terms, I don't know, and I don't even know whether I want to try. I think it's a political fight, and that's the next thing that squatters need. They need some way of accessing politics. And there's a reason why Kenya looks like this and Istanbul looks like that, and they're both squatter communities and no one owns the property. And the reason is that there are two quirks of Turkish law that, if I had my way, would be available to in every community all over the world. The first quirk is what's called the Geje Khandu Law. And that basically means that if you get your scrapyard home built overnight and you're in by morning, and before the authorities catch you, you can't be evicted without due process of law. Then it's a court fight and a public fight. And most politicians and most judges don't like being seen throwing people out of their homes, throwing the desperate poor out of their homes. The second really innovative thing in Turkey is every neighborhood in a Turkish city has two mayors: the local mayor, the small city mayor, and the big city mayor. And again, under a weird quirk of Turkish law, once you have 2,000 people in a community, whether you own or don't own the land, you can petition the federal government to be recognized as a legal sub-municipality. And what that gives you immediately is politics and a way of interacting with the big city. So in Sultanbeyli, there's a popularly elected squatter mayor who has his office high atop the 7-story squatters' city hall and presides over a government which provides sanitation and public works and bus service and many of the functions that we take for granted in the cities that we know. So not every country has that, and I would argue that it would be great if squatters could organize to try to demand it. But that's why I see the future, and it's a bit of an irony talking here at a conference called PopTech, but I see the future of these communities and the future of what I believe are the fastest growing cities of the future to not be technological, but to be fundamentally human and about leadership and organizing and empowerment. So I say that the future of these cities involves the civic leaders who live in these communities. And I'll introduce you to just a couple of them. This is Geeta Jiwa. She's the woman in the center here. This is Mumbai. Geeta lives with her daughters in a tent on a median strip of the Western Express Highway in Mumbai. Sadly, because there early this year were a number of demolitions led by the Mumbai government, she's probably no longer there. And she was probably forced to squat further out of town. But she's articulate, she's angry, and she needs some way of channeling her feelings and her thoughts and her needs into interacting with the political structure to demand the right to a home. This is, I only knew her as Nene, which means grandmother in Turkish. But that's her Geje Khandu house behind her. She's extremely proud of it. She was a little low on money when I met her, and so she had actually let her electrical service lapse because she couldn't pay the bills, and she was living without electricity. But she wants to fight for her neighborhood, and she can be a creative force in the city if the city is willing to listen to her. And this is Richard Muthama in Kibera. He's like Kibera's press agent in Nairobi. He's a roving street photographer. And he takes pictures of social functions and sells them to the local residents. And very committed to Kibera as his home, even though he lives in a one-room mud hut with his wife and 2 kids. He needs the empowerment of being able to interact with politics. And finally, my nomination to be the next mayor of Rio de Janeiro, my friend Zezinho, here with his kids who share the same body type as he does. Zezinho is a fruit merchant, and he came to Rocinha when he was 7 years old. And he started with a pushcart, and he roved the hillside where Rocinha is, and made enough money to purchase, and squatters do, buy and sell these possession rights. He purchased this little kiosk on the side of the main drag, and this is where he has his fruit market, and he has parlayed his fruit and vegetable market into enough money to build himself a 3-story house. Originally, he was living in a wooden hut, and enough money that he actually sends these 2 wonderful kids to private school. Very creative force, very diligent, very supportive of the neighborhood, and an extremely interesting and moral man. And I think that the future of the cities of the world are in the hands of people like Zezinho. I hope in some way that my work brings that out and encourages them and the governments in those countries to interact with them, because it's not only about aid, and maybe it's not even fundamentally about aid and debt relief and things that are on the international agenda about doing something in the developing world. It's really about the people within organizing their own capacity to transform their communities. And that's the message I want to leave you with. So we'll have some extra time for questions at the end, but I thank you for the opportunity to address PopTech. Thanks, Andrew.
Great.